everybody. It's fantastic to be here joining you at the forum. Amy, thanks for that wonderful introduction. I'm Sam Arons, the Director of Sustainability at Lyft, and I am here this afternoon to tell you about the future of mobility and how we see that playing out at Lyft. So without further ado, we'll jump right in. So I'm just going to take you very briefly through some of the history of transportation, not all of the history of transportation, of course. But in this country, the first two revolutions that we witnessed were rail and cars. And of course, rail got going in the mid-1800s, and we laid something like 30,000 miles of track that connected remote outposts like the tiny towns of Chicago and Baltimore and Los Angeles to the rest of the country and allowed them to grow into the mega cities that they are today. And it really opened up economic development and sort of catapulted the country into the 20th century. And then, of course, with the advent of the automobile in the early 1900s, that was the second transportation revolution. And similarly, that provided a large degree of personal freedom that had not existed previously. Also allowed the economy to flourish, to connect places that might not have been connected by rail previously. So there were many, many, many benefits to both of these transformations, both of these revolutions. However, there were some downsides. Now, one of those you can see right here in this picture with the smoke belching out of the engine, the steam engine, or coal engine, whatever that is. And the other is that, of course, we had to redesign our cities for cars. And in some cases, that led to very good things, and in some cases, it led to very bad things. And so this is just an example of some of those downsides that we have, that we are experiencing because we have really designed our cities for cars. So just to touch on a few of these. There are over 700 million parking spaces in the United States today. That's about 2 parking spaces per person, roughly. And the reason why we need so many parking spaces is because we all own cars, and they're parked 96% of the time and used 4% of the time. So really, the cars that we have, you could say, are more parking machines rather than driving machines. We just basically park them places and leave them there for all but 1 hour of the day, roughly. And then when we do use them, about 75% of trips are single occupancy trips, which of course leads to all sorts of congestion, which is getting worse and worse as time goes on. So if you multiply those two factors together, we're using the cars 4% of the time, and when we use them, there's only one person in them, which is a 20% occupancy rate. If you multiply 4% by 20%, you're now at less than 1% efficiency in terms of using that asset. Now, in the US, the personal vehicle market is a $2 trillion per year market. So collectively, we're spending $2 trillion per year on private car ownership, and we're utilizing it with 1% efficiency. That is a really terrible way to be spending so much money. We could be doing a lot better than that. And so what we're seeing is the third transportation revolution, which is mobility as a service. And there's a lot of promise here. We see the world shifting from ownership to ridership. And actually, peer-to-peer ride sharing, which is what we offer at Lyft, was created by Lyft in 2012. And the amount of growth that we've seen, the amount of demand for this, has just been breathtaking. I'll show you on the next slide in one sec what that looks like. But I think it's really proving out the fact that people are kind of fed up with the status quo. Why do we have all this traffic? Why are we spending $2 trillion a year and utilizing those assets with 1% efficiency? It just doesn't make sense. If we can introduce mobility as a service, which, if you think about it, that's what we want. We want mobility, right? We don't want freeways because we like freeways. We don't want parking lots because we like parking lots. We only have to have those so that we can get around, so we can have mobility. If there's another, better, cheaper way to do mobility, why don't we just do that instead? And we're seeing the demand for this grow and grow and grow, so it's very exciting. This chart here shows the growth. This is the cumulative number of rides that Lyft has given since it was founded in 2012. And that's quite a hockey stick if I've ever seen one. Now, what's interesting about this is a couple of things. So first of all, we're now in all 50 states and in Canada. We serve 95% of the US population has access to Lyft in their community. But what's interesting is that even despite this tremendous amount of growth, still less than 1% of vehicle miles traveled, VMT, in the US is provided by ride sharing. So if you take a step back, I mean, that's kind of crazy, right? Like, we've seen this huge uptick. People are using Lyft and ride-sharing services all the time, and yet, even despite that, less than 1% of all miles traveled are being done through ride-sharing. So there's a tremendous opportunity here to keep growing this out, and as we do, we will be able to start to address all of these downsides that we have from private car ownership, and really make some inroads, so to speak, on all these issues. So from our perspective, the future of mobility really has 4 key elements. Those are the ones you see here: shared, electric, autonomous, and multimodal. So now what's interesting is that we've barely scratched the surface on all of these things. Shared arguably is the one that we've done the most with so far. And of course, finally, EVs are starting to get, EVs meaning electric vehicles, are starting to get close to cost parity with subsidies still. But we're just scratching the surface, and it's going to be tremendously exciting as each of these 4 elements sort of comes into its own. That is really going to turbocharge this third transportation revolution and make mobility as a service, we think, the primary mode of transportation that people will use around the world. So I'm going to go through each of these one by one and kind of talk a little bit about what we're doing and how we see this playing out. So on the shared side, we actually just launched a redesign of the Lyft app, which is being rolled out over the course of the summer, I believe. So some of you may have it, some of you may not, but this is what it looks like. And the goal here is a couple things. So first of all, we just want to simplify for people. So you can see it's a little bit more, spare of a design. And we want to put shared rides front and center, and that's what we've done. And the reason is that we have a goal to make 50% of all Lyft rides be shared rides by the end of 2020. We already have been making tremendous progress there. So in the markets where shared rides are available, and by the way, this is the product that formerly was known as Lyft Line. Now we're just calling it shared, because I think some consumers didn't really know what line meant. In a skiing community, however, people would appreciate that. But we're switching to the word shared to just make it that much simpler for people. And instead of having the type of vehicle hidden behind a little menu, sort of a secret menu, right? For those of you who've used the app, there's a little picture of a car, and you just have to know somehow that you're supposed to touch that, and then a little menu pops up, and you can say, oh, I want to take a shared ride, or a larger vehicle, or whatever. How are you supposed to know there's a menu there? Many people don't even know that it's there. So what we're doing is we're kind of doing away with that menu, and we're just putting shared right there, right in front of the user's face, so they can see, oh, I have an option to use a shared ride, and we make it very clear what the trade-offs are, right? So, there's going to be a cost and a time trade-off. That's kind of the value proposition here, and we're seeing that 35% of our users are willing to make that trade-off, and this hopefully will make it much easier for them because it actually gives a time estimate and a cost estimate. So it's very clear, if I'm in a rush, maybe I'd like to take a shared ride, but I don't have time right now. But if I'm not in a rush, tomorrow when I'm doing my next ride, then I'll choose shared. So it makes the choice very, very simple for people. And getting people to use the shared option more and more is critical to our environmental strategy, because we want to reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled while we increase the number of passenger miles traveled, right? So, and that's about providing that mobility as a service. We want to help people move around from where they need to go, but we don't need to use as many vehicle miles to do that if we can get folks into shared rides. So it's very exciting that we're launching this, and we'll see where it goes. Okay, on the electric side, so this is the part that I am working the most on. And the opportunity before us really is nothing less than to eliminate pollution from transportation, which is obviously a very lofty goal, and it's not something that we can do overnight, but I think that's the promise of what we can do if we're able to electrify the entire fleet of vehicles and have them eventually, of course, charged from renewable energy as well. As a side note, that's part of the reason why I was so excited to hop over to Lyft from Google, because as Amy mentioned, I had spent 10 years at Google negotiating renewable energy contracts for the data centers. And while today a very small percentage of vehicles on the Lyft platform are electric, as we continue to have more success and roll out electric vehicles more broadly, I think it's very exciting, but I'm kind of an energy nerd. These two industries are merging, basically. Transportation and electricity are coming together, and Lyft is right at that intersection of these industries. So it's a tremendously exciting time, and there's a lot of promise here. Now, in the meantime, because it will take some time to electrify the entire fleet, and we'll get into some of the reasons why that's difficult and complicated shortly. But in the meantime, we said, well, what can we do now? We can't snap our fingers and suddenly have hundreds of thousands of EVs on the road tomorrow. But what we can do now is we can offset all of the greenhouse gas emissions, all the carbon emissions from all those rides. So we made a very bold commitment back in April. This was actually the first project I worked on when I joined the company, to offset the carbon from all of our rides. And so now, from that day forward, every Lyft ride that you might take is a carbon neutral ride. And that means that it has no net impact on the climate. Thank you. And by the way, we are the first and only ride-sharing company to offer that. But what we're doing there is we are purchasing carbon offsets. And for those who may not be familiar with what those are, essentially what we're doing is we're paying others to reduce their emissions in a way that's much cheaper and quicker than we could do ourselves, right? So if we wanted to reduce our emissions directly, we'd have to basically electrify all the vehicles and charge them from renewables. We're going to do that. It's going to take a lot of time, and we're getting there. But in the meantime, we're paying others. So as just a short example of that, one of our projects is a wind farm that we're paying for to get built, essentially. We're paying for reductions in landfill gas emissions. We're paying for reductions in a particular automotive manufacturing process that releases greenhouse gas emissions. Right? So each of these efforts wouldn't happen unless there was so-called carbon revenue. So we're providing that carbon revenue, which is enough to get those projects over the hurdle to actually get built. And so therefore, our payment results in a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And so that reduction is equivalent to the amount of emissions that the vehicles are producing. And therefore, together, we have offset the emissions to have carbon neutrality. Now, in terms of deploying electric vehicles themselves, what's very interesting is that ride sharing and other potential high mileage applications are the place that it makes the most sense to deploy electric vehicles first. And the reason for that is because of two factors. There's the upfront purchase price of an electric vehicle, and then there's the operational cost of an electric vehicle as compared to a conventional fossil fuel powered vehicle. So of course today an electric vehicle is more expensive, and that's because batteries are expensive still, although the price is coming down very rapidly. But it remains the case that it costs more to buy an EV like this Chevy Bolt here shown on this slide than it does to buy a Chevy Malibu, let's say. So that's a barrier, right? If you have to go pay extra money, you may not be able to scale that program. And our drivers may not be willing to make that purchase. And remember, the vast majority of the vehicles on the Lyft platform are not owned or controlled by Lyft. They're actually owned by the drivers who come to the platform as they would like to, right? Some people drive a lot, some people drive a little. Many people just use their car, to make a little bit of extra money, help to make ends meet, help to pay the bills. And we can't, go ask people to suddenly spend, an extra $10,000 or $20,000 to buy an electric vehicle. But the upside of electric vehicles right now is, of course, the emissions reductions, first and foremost, but also the operational savings. And so And that comes through the fact that there are many fewer moving parts in an electric vehicle, right? So this Chevy Bolt here has something like 100 moving parts, roughly, whereas a Chevy Malibu might have 1,000 moving parts. And so there's just more things that can break in a conventional internal combustion engine than can break in an electric vehicle. And so as a result, you have less maintenance cost. Also, in most places, you have a lower fuel cost. That's not true everywhere, right? There's some places where electricity is expensive enough that it's not cheaper than gasoline, but in many places, charging from electricity is cheaper than gasoline. So if you sort of look at the higher purchase price and you compare that to the lower operational cost or the operational savings, you can imagine a world where those two things would sort of cancel each other out. And as the purchase price premium gets lower, right, as battery prices come down, those operational savings will offset the purchase premium more and more quickly. And because those savings accrue on a per mile driven basis, if you have a vehicle like this one in a high mileage ride sharing fleet, you're going to accrue those savings and offset that extra capital cost much more quickly than somebody who maybe would buy this as their second or third vehicle, drive it 4% of the time, and leave it parked most of the time. So as a result, the economics of electric vehicles work better in a high mileage application because you accrue those savings more quickly, and therefore, our hypothesis is that it will make a lot more sense to deploy electric vehicles into ride sharing first. And so expect to see more and more electric vehicles coming onto the platform as we go forward before they become as widespread in the sort of general private car ownership market. Autonomous. So we have a very bold prediction here. We think that within 5 years, half of all Lyft rides given will be autonomous. And it's interesting because as that happens, of course, the cost will decrease, could be by as much as 80%. So if you thought it was cheap today to take Lyft across town, imagine when it's in an autonomous vehicle. Our autonomous strategy involves it's almost an internal horse race. We have our own autonomous R&D effort. It's called Level 5. It's actually a separate office. It's based down on the peninsula in Palo Alto. But we also work with partners. In this case, Aptiv, who are developing their own autonomous technology, and they're deploying on the Lyft platform as a place to get experience with autonomous technology. This particular photo is from the Las Vegas Strip, and Aptiv has deployed their vehicles there on Lyft. So if you happen to be in Vegas at some point, try calling Lyft on the Strip, and you may get a ride in this car right here. But today, it covers very limited ride types. So there are only rides that are on a fixed route along the Strip. It only drives in good weather. I guess it is driving at night, although you could imagine, maybe there could be a situation where it's driving only during the day. But as autonomous vehicles come into force, we don't have to wait until we have the perfect autonomous vehicle that can drive in every single situation, right? We don't need an AV that can drive in a blizzard. We don't need an AV that can drive, through the streets of, Calcutta with animals roaming everywhere, like who knows what, right? Eventually, presumably, autonomous technology will get there, but today that's not where it is. But that's okay. We can already start deploying it now as long as we keep it in safe applications where there's much less chance that something unexpected would happen. All right, so we'll jump to the next one. And then finally, the multimodal element of the autonomous, or of the future of mobility is very exciting and also very new. This is probably the newest thing that we're doing at Lyft. We are integrating bikes and scooters, meaning electric scooters like that one, and transit integration as well. So you may have heard, but we recently acquired Motivate, which is the largest bike sharing company in the US. They run the Ford Go Bike program in the Bay Area. They run the City Bike program in New York and a number of others around the country. We also have started to submit permit applications for electric scooters in various cities. I think so far those applications have gone in San Francisco, Denver, and Santa Monica, and presumably there will be more to come. And finally, we have, for the first time, started to integrate transit into the Lyft app directly. So you can say, I am standing right here and I want to go to over there, and the app will say, okay, first, take a bike 1 mile to the train station. Here's the train schedule. Get on the train. Eventually there'll be payment integration, presumably as well. So it's already paid for. You get on the train. You get to the other side. Then you take your Lyft ride for 2 miles to your office or whatever it might be. So that whole flow can be within the app natively, and help people to get to where they need to go in the way that makes the most sense. Because not every trip should be in a single occupancy vehicle, or a vehicle at all, or a car at all, right? It just may make a lot more sense. Hey, if the weather's nice and there's tons of traffic, why not hop on a scooter and go 1 mile? That's a lot better than jumping in a car, even if it's a shared ride, and then just contributing that much more to congestion. So we're very excited about this. It's very, very, very early days. You won't be able to use any of this quite yet, but our engineering teams and product teams are working feverishly to get this all incorporated. So stay tuned, and you will start to see this getting integrated soon. OK, so the bold prediction of all of this is that by 2025, we think private car ownership will more or less end in US cities. And that's a very exciting thing. And again, it's for sort of all the reasons we've talked about. Why are we spending $2 trillion on this? Which boils down to about $9,000 per vehicle per year. Why do we want to deal with all these headaches? Insurance, dealing with maintenance, all this stuff, when you can simply just have a subscription that's for a fraction of the price, and it takes away all those headaches, and you still have the exact same ability that you had before. It's just going to make sense to do this. And assuming that we can realize this future, that will allow people to say, hey, I don't need my second car. Actually, I don't even need my first car. I don't need those 4 parking spaces that I have at home and at work and the grocery store and all these different places. And so what we can do with that is we can redesign our cities for people and not for cars, while, by the way, we reduce emissions and all the other things. This is just a quick example of what can happen when you remove this infrastructure that's built for cars. This is the San Francisco Ferry Building along the waterfront. And the picture on the left, this is a before and after. So the picture on the left is before 1989, where there was a double-decker freeway that just went along the waterfront. I'm sure some of you probably saw this back in the day. And it basically cut off the ferry building and really the entire waterfront from the rest of the city, and it just was this no man's land where you wouldn't go, and it was super shady and not a fun place to be. Now, in this particular example, it was the 1989 earthquake which damaged the freeway, so that's a bit of a sort of a force majeure situation, I guess. But the result was that the freeway was torn down, and it was the whole waterfront was converted into a pedestrian area with a bustling bunch of shops and a farmer's market every week, and families walking around, and it's just a very, very pleasant place to be. And so we shouldn't wish for more earthquakes, of course, but what we should wish for is to take what we're going to be able to do with this transportation revolution and redesign our cities and reclaim them for people in this kind of way. I think this should be an inspirational picture, and there's other examples around the country as well. Times Square in New York is another example. But this is the kind of thing that we can do, and not only reduce emissions from transportation, not only help to expand mobility to those who don't have it today, not only have cheaper and better and more convenient transportation, but we can also reimagine what our cities look like and how we live in them and travel through them. So I will stop there, and thank you very much.